So a warm welcome to this seminar and to the Ratio Institute. We will discuss national regulations on the one hand and the global labor market on the other hand. The Ratio Institute is a multidisciplinary research institute, independent one. We focus on entrepreneurship, labor markets, institutions, and so forth. My name is Johanna Grönbeck. I'm head of communications here at Ratio, and I will be the one moderating this seminar today. We are very happy to have all of you here, and we are also very happy to bring together scientists with policy entrepreneurs and other experts. So the point of this seminar is to partly listen to researchers and other experts, and also to mingle and talk with each other. This seminar consists of two parts. The first part will be in English, and that's the more scientific part of it. And we have the other part, which will be in Swedish with the social partners, Swedish social partners. And how do we mark this transition, you wonder? With fika, of course. And I don't promise, but we will hopefully have time for Q&As. That depends. And let me also just say that this seminar is being recorded and will later on be published on Ratio's YouTube channel. And we have some photographers here, so if you don't want to be photographed, let me know. And with that said, it's time to start. And let me introduce to you our keynote speaker, Samuel Dehan, who is a law professor at Queen's University in Canada. You will hold a keynote presenting your recent research and put it into context of broader labor market globalization trends. And I can tell all of you that the piece that Samuel is referring to and presenting, it will later on also be published in Swedish. And with that, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So, how do I access my slides?
Just click.
Just?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, meet some new faces, and also see some familiar faces. So, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the global labor market and also the law of the global labor market. So as our dear colleague Joanna just said, so I'm a law professor and I'm the chief of policy at Deal, and I'm running the Deal Lab for Global Employment, which is a policy consortium in global work policy. And we also do AI research for compliance and employment law. So I want to organize this discussion, I hope this to be a discussion, around three themes. So first I want to talk about our data. So obviously what I'm going to present is only representative of what I see at Deal, because that's the kind of data I've got access to, right? So but with that in mind, over the last, so Deal, I don't know if you're familiar with this company, so it's a company that was created 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago, and their mission, our mission, because also I'm part of the company, our mission is to facilitate labor compliance across the world, right, and global hiring. Okay, so they started 4 years ago, and in the last 3 years we've seen an incredible growth. So we've been helping companies to hire workers around all over more than 120 countries, and we've had about more than 300,000 workers. It's actually a little bit more than that. So the company is so the data I'm going to be presenting is obviously representative of a small sample of the global labor market, but it might be also relevant to some extent, right? So first I'd like to talk about the data on the global hiring market, okay? And I want to talk a little bit about the Nordics and Swedish, and also a few days ago we published a report on AI jobs, right? There's been a bit of a hype, but we want to know whether this hype is just garbage and people are talking about it, they're not doing much, or whether there is actually a lot of hiring taking place as a result of this AI hype. Then I want to talk about the policy and the legal challenges related to hiring workers outside your jurisdiction. So I'm talking from the perspective of an employer, and as an employee, what kind of rights or benefits you can expect if you're working for a company that's not based in Sweden, for example, that's not based in your legal system. So over the last year, so that's our latest report, but that's last year's report. So now we're putting together the latest report. So as you may imagine, as of December 2020, there was a lot of contract termination. But with that in mind, even if there was a lot of termination, hiring was still outpacing termination. So hiring cross-border still outpace any downsizing trend. So there's some really interesting dynamics that we've noticed on the labor market. So you could define these as like some of their winning players of the labor market, and some of them are not doing as well as others. So it sustained its momentum. So global hiring has been sustaining its momentum all over until late 2022, even in spite of the slowdown of the economy. So, but what's interesting is that we've seen some new economies that have been playing an interesting role in the global market. So, for example, the United States has been one of the biggest providers of global workers, and companies that are hiring American workers are based in Mexico. Interesting, right? No one would have thought this in the NAFTA context even 5 years ago, right? So other countries have been doing very well over the last few years with global work. So I'm talking about the Philippines, India, Brazil, Argentina. I mean, there are various factors. I'm not an economist, but there have been a lot of studies as to why, for example, Argentina is looking for jobs elsewhere. I'm sure inflation has a role to play in that decision, right, or in that trend. So what about the AI hype, right? So as I said before, there's been a lot of enthusiasm around the growth of AI, obviously since ChatGPT, but we wanted to verify, we wanted to test the assumption of whether is this really creating a lot of jobs. So the answer is it's obviously yes. So there's been a massive trend of massive hiring trend, a fast increasing hiring trend over the last year or so. What would be more interesting, and now we're in the process of compiling that data, is whether the AI hype has had an impact on sectors where AI has been changing their industry. So for example, in law, marketing, I mean, there's a lot of fears whether this is going to create job loss. I want to verify whether that assumption is true and whether there's less hiring in areas where AI has been considering to impact significantly these markets. So AI roles paid through deal again. So this is just based on deal data. It grew by 60% in the last year. Salary increase also has been increasing, and the winners in this, I mean, not surprisingly, in this, so the U.S. has been dominating the AI hiring, but it's been closely followed by Canada, which is interesting because Canada has been massively investing in AI research over the last few years. I'm not here because I'm based in Canada, but so Toronto has become a massive hub, and interestingly also a lot of Canadian organizations are hiring American workers, and which is a big pride I think for Canada, because a lot of fast-growing companies created in Canada, they end up being pulled by the Silicon Valley, and they are presented as American company even though they were actually created in Canada. So in Europe, one of the big winners in this market is the United Kingdom, and to lesser extent Germany. So in terms of who is providing these workers, so who are the workers interested in or taking these jobs, India is leading the way, and followed by Canada and Brazil. Okay. So now what about the Nordics? So that has nothing to do with AI role, it's just more general. So, and that's up to last week. So we've seen this steady growth over the last few years. So workers hired globally from Sweden have grown by 7.4% in 23. Workers hired globally from the Nordics also, there's a growth of 30%. So it's been growing steadily, right? So what about company based in Sweden? So they're hiring, a lot of companies are hiring globally. So again, a steady growth of 25%. You know, every year last year was about 20%. So in companies based in the Nordics hiring globally, we've seen a 78% growth. So that's quite significant. It's one of the fastest hiring trend. So, and I don't know if some of you, I'm not an economist again, and I'm not specialized in Nordics, but I think, you know, based on what I've read from Lotta's work, I mean, there's a skill shortage here, and which is causing significant issue in the Swedish labor market. I mean, there's also some mobility issues due to maybe, you know, rising barriers, trade barriers, or tighter immigration restriction, and maybe this aligns very well with what we're seeing, because a lot of POs and employer of record company, they seem to be providing a solution to that labor shortage. Whether that's, you know, that's in other factors involved, obviously, this is very much up for debate. So now another question for us, I mean, as researchers, and also I think for EOR, employer of record company and POs, is global work here to stay? That's an interesting question. So short answer is yes, but again, based on the data that we've been gathering over the last 2 years, we can fairly agree that thank God COVID is over. So I guess now we can actually see data that are significant. But there is still a pushback, right? I mean, we all heard that a lot of companies are really pushing for return to the office policies. So, and I think a lot of firms still believe that there's a productivity, that work from home damages productivity, right? So, but again, so that's a study. So I'm writing a paper with an economist, a Stanford economist, Nick Bloom, and we're looking at data from Deal, and I've been looking at his past work, and it's interesting. You see the U.S. labor productivity growth was 1.2% in 22, and it picked up during COVID, right? And a lot of people ended up going. That's the very moment where a lot of workers ended up working from home. So that means, I mean, it is almost miraculous considering the state of the economy in 22. And that was at the time where a lot of workers ended up working from home. So, which factors is really impacting this productivity spike? It's hard to say. You know, maybe there's not lots of time in commuting. Yeah, there are issues with work from home. Maybe lack of mentorship. Maybe issues with management. But it seems that it is still not damaging productivity. There are plenty of studies showing that at least, you know, hybrid work might be a little bit more efficient than full remote work, but that's there's no consensus on whether productivity, on whether work from home is actually tanking or affecting productivity to some extent. So, but another interesting question is what's, you know, let's look at it from the perspective of regulation, where the regulation is going, and when it comes to global work, and what kind of challenges is it raising for both global workers and global employers, right? So there are a lot of issues related to hiring workers in another legal system. Obviously, one of the main issues is you got to be able to cope with the domestic labor regulation, and there are a lot of various issues that we've been trying to explore. So obviously there's worker classification, there's social security and benefits, incomes and payroll tax, corporate tax, immigration, data security, even IP rights is problematic, right? So, but I want to focus mostly on the contractor dilemma, what we call the contractor dilemma, which is really the classic issue of worker classification. So one problem with, and I think that's why a lot of the EOR company and the PO companies are extremely successful, is one problem with global work is that if you want to hire a full-time employee, if you don't have a legal entity in another legal system, you pretty much stuck with one solution, is that hiring someone as an independent contractor, right? This is problematic because that may not be what the employee want, the workers want, and they are at risk of misclassification, right? So, I mean, the dilemma is already slightly complex at the domestic level. I mean, many Supreme Courts have been trying to resolve that question of the gig workers. But here we're in a very different context. I mean, the global workers we're talking about, tech workers, I mean, they're really not concerned with the same issues as gig workers. But in the domestic context, there are case law principles or regulation that helps you to determine whether someone is an independent contractor and employee. But in the global context, if you don't have a legal entity elsewhere, often what employers do is to hire someone as an independent contractor, which is really problematic. So one solution, and that's what we've been trying to do a deal, is just helping companies to improve labor law enforcement and labor law compliance, right? So there are many ways to go about this, better dissemination of legal information. And what I've been doing also in another lab, so my lab at the university, it's called the Conflict Analytics Lab, which is one of the main partners of the Deal Lab. So it's based at McGill and at Queen's University. So we've created 5 years ago a predictive AI system that can give a suggested prediction as to whether a worker should be classified as a contractor or an employee. So the systems have been trained on the case law of Canada and the US, and interestingly, it has a very high accuracy rate and a high confidence index, right? So what happened is that we rolled out this system. That's how the collaboration between Queen's University and the Conflict Analytics Lab started in 2020. So we tested it and see whether employers and employees found it useful, and in fact they did, right? So it ended up, in some legal system, we can predict whether a worker is an independent contractor or an employee with 94% accuracy, okay? But it's not true in most legal systems, right? So now the project is to roll out this system. So it works in a very user-friendly way. So either the worker, we usually make this test. We usually ensure that the worker is taking this test, and that's a comparison with ChatGPT, and ChatGPT doesn't work very well. So that we guarantee from the worker's perspective whether they should be reclassified as an employee. But there's a lot of issues with that. First, so we're rolling out this system now. We're investing massive resources to train a global algorithm in 120 countries. So we've been compiling the case law in more than 120 legal systems. So you can imagine the amount of work in terms of data labeling, the AI resources as well. But it's not really realistic. Like we can't, the idea is that we upload a contract, we try constantly assess the nature of the work relationship. We can't even process the contracts. Because I don't know, I don't want to bore you with legal details, but in many legal systems, the contract doesn't really has that much value. The nature of the relationship is that of a employee relationship. A judge would decide that you are an employee, right? So there are a lot of issues, right? But one solution that a lot of companies have been using is the employer of record, right? So the employer of record is you may be familiar with the employer of record, and if you are, I'm sorry if I'm going to get tell you about something that you already know. So it's basically there's a third party, like a company like Deal, Oyster, or Remote, or Papaya. There are a few of them, like there are globalization partners. There've been a few of them that have been growing over the last few years, and they have legal entities in many legal systems, and they help small companies or even larger companies to hire workers on their behalf, and they're usually ensure compliance with local domestic labor law, but that causes a lot of issues, right? Because it's not as straightforward. So the first problem is that legal institution, even if it's not new, it's been around since the early 2000s. It's not a creation. They haven't invented anything, but a lot of policymakers, a lot of governments, even a lot of labor lawyers don't really know and don't really care about that system. It's not that interesting, right? So there's not a lot of research, and a lot of labor ministries don't really know what it is. So, and in fact, a lot of them do think that the employer of record is some kind of a temp agency. So it's a short-term solution, and there's not even regulation. The only countries in Europe that have very advanced regulation on the employer of record is the Netherlands, and maybe to some extent Germany, where it becomes a real legal category where a lot of the questions that need to be taken into consideration, such as pension, social security, for the employer of record worker is carefully taken into consideration. Right? In many legal systems, including WAM-based, Canada or the US, it's very much unclear what is the status. And it raises a lot of issues. First, the first issue, okay, is the fact that there needs to be some educating around that concept. The second problem is that there is an issue of co-employment, right? So that means that the employer of record company might end up being the joint employment liabilities, or whether the client company might also end up also being considered as the employer. So it's a bit unclear, right? And judges, I mean, especially labor judges, I mean, they would look at the reality of the relationship, and if they think there's a joint employment relationship, they will decide that there's a joint employment relationship, or the client company should be considered as the employer. And again, we've been compiling a lot of case law on that issue in about 20 jurisdictions, and it's unclear, right? Some legal systems think, yes, there's joint employment. Some systems never even addressed the question, so that raises a lot of questions. Right? Another problem is workers' rights. So yet, even if technically, legally speaking, the employer of record worker is a full-time employee. So it's a full-fledged employee, so in theory, they have the same rights as an employee. So minimum wage, obviously, and the kind of benefits that any employee. But there are some exceptions. From a tax perspective, from an equity compensation perspective, that's not clear. You can't really benefit from the same rights as a classic domestic employee, right? I'm not going to get into the details because that's very boring legal details, but you get the idea. So and another problem, and the final problem, what I found is based on this empirical research that we've been doing with worker classification case law, and we've been testing this new data through our algorithm, what's interesting is that a good chunk, and I would say a good third of the data of the case law, and I'm talking about only about 15 legal systems, so mostly North America and Europe. We don't know yet what's the position of judges in other legal systems, is that for a good chunk of cases, judges are very much torn. So for the same fact, for the same type of workers, 3 judges would say that person is an independent contractor, and another group of judges would say he's an employee. So what do you do with that? So I mean, that means we don't know what these people belong. There's genuine gray area. So what do we do with these workers, right? So the solution, you could say, okay, at the international level, right? I mean, if you're, you can hire someone as an independent contractor, so you can use an employee of record. But in fact, the problem is like the employer of record is not the perfect solution because many workers actually don't really fall into that category. So I think another solution, and that's an argument that I've been making for quite a few years, and I'm not the only one, and actually it already exists in many legal systems. So for example, in Canada, we have this concept of the dependent contractor. I think Germany also has that, but I don't really know the details of that category in Germany. So the idea is like, why don't we think about a global dependent contractor, right? And there are 2 important, I'd say, pillars with this new category. Obviously, the first one is what kind of benefits that individual would be getting, right? But on that front, it's actually quite good news because the notion of self-employment has been evolving quite well. I mean, there's a new EU directive on platform work, and there has been a lot of progress on the kind of benefits that independent contractors have been getting over the last years. So Deal, and again, a lot of other companies have been doing an incredible job at creating health plans, pension plans for independent contractors. There's also been some work on the portability of benefits, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think this is where the law and the regulation might be going, and I think it should be applauded because it's good news. The problem is that there's still this division in the law, this binary division between these 2 categories, and there's also very much of a negative stigma attached to the notion of the contractor. In the context of the gig economy, for sure, and it is well justified. But in other areas, I think it doesn't really make necessarily a lot of sense. So however, where the dependent contractor notion is really lacking is on the job security front, right? There's very little unemployment. Very few countries have invested resources or implemented any reforms when it comes to unemployment benefits. In fact, actually, it's not true. In Canada, a dependent contractor, they would be entitled to termination compensation, right? So which is not the case in most legal system. When you're a contractor, if it's not, there's no provision in your contract, the statute or the regulation would not allow you to get a termination compensation. So there is some progress in that area. But there is some odd stuff at the same time. So for example, in Canada, if you are a dependent contractor, you can get termination compensation, but you may not be entitled to minimum wage. So there's a lot of contradiction, and again, I think this requires a little bit of clarification, right? But so that's about it. I just wanted to give you an overview of where the market stand. What the kind of data we have, and also what are the regulatory challenges that I think we might be facing over the next few years.
Thank you so much. And Samuel talked a lot about not being an economist, and the next researcher is not an economist, and neither is the next one, but the one thereafter is an economist. So with that said, thank you so much, Samuel. And now we will have the three other researchers, and first is Niklas Sellberg, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at Lund University. Welcome.
Thank you, and most importantly, not an economist. Yeah, so thank you so much, Ratio, for the invitation to engage with this work. My slides are here. So sure, I will have some comments on your paper, and my first comment is that the call for a new policy infrastructure is a well-researched and highly relevant and thought-provoking intervention and contribution to an important and topical discussion, which has to a large extent focused on gig workers. So this is larger than gig workers. This is super important to remember. Regulation of work is in dire need of an updated foundation capable of capturing the diverging rationales of legislation. Not least visible in Sweden, where we've had a large reform of employment protection the last year, and now we need to sort of understand what's the overarching narrative behind this field of law. So while I definitely see the same challenges that you have sort of empirically described, I also share a lot of your sort of policy recommendations and your suggestions for improving labor law. I nevertheless want to make some additional points from the perspective then of labor law, and again, not from economy. So I will focus on two aspects of your intervention. I will expand a bit on flexible and remote work and how that fundamentally challenges more or less tacky notions of labor law, and then reflect a bit on the boundaries of labor law. So if we start with flexible work and the implications for labor law, I think we are, of course, as you described in your paper, witnessing some kind of movement from protection against dismissal and just cause for dismissal and so on into a more employability situation, where the important thing is that you have many separate and discrete tasks or contracts, if you will. So, but what does that mean for workers' legitimate expectations for job security and continuity in work? I think that what we need to focus on today is training and skills development that actually goes beyond the employer's immediate operations and are more sectorally or relevant for an entire field of enterprise. Furthermore, I think we need to move away from non-competes and garden leave systems. They are inherently incompatible with an employability system. That is sort of an unfair limitation on workers. My second point as regards flexible work is about communication. In the old model, employees did as they were told. So the assumption is that the guy on top knows better than me. Now we need to rethink that idea and acknowledge that information must come also from workers, because workers are more knowledgeable than managers usually about how work is to be performed and what's important in my line of work. So there is a need for mechanisms for information sharing and cooperation, which actually sort of goes beyond performing according to a contract and performing work just as it's stipulated in my employment record. So this goes beyond just doing what's in your contract. And subsequent to that, I think we need to focus more on about profit sharing mechanisms, because those are actually fundamental to partnership within companies. So when work is no longer about following instructions, but to think creatively and solve problems, the role of workers becomes different and extends beyond performing according to a contract. And profit sharing puts sort of binds the parties together in cooperation. That is my second point. My third point is about a new role for law and adjudication. Key to this development is an increased importance of discretion. Managers need more discretion to steer the operations and decide what's to be done, whereas workers also need more discretion to decide on how to best perform my tasks and so on, and how to decide on executing tasks. So when all parties need more discretion, the role of law becomes sort of less prominent, because it's more difficult to define the legal boundaries to conduct, what is acceptable as an employer or as an employee. So law might be less important in the future than perhaps to the benefit of economists. Sociologists, they are hopelessly left out. Sorry, Lotta, no? Okay. So then I come to remote work more. What implications can we see for employment regulation when more and more people are working remotely? So first of all, we see less opportunity for supervision and control of work. You don't have middle management standing over your shoulder telling you what to do. Well, to the extent that there's less opportunity for supervision and control, there is larger scope for opportunistic behavior on part of employees. So we will likely see, I think, a shift in how we measure work, what is a lot of work, a little bit of work, and how do we remunerate work. I suppose we will see a shift from hourly wages and remuneration based on time units to task-based remuneration, which is essentially a hallmark also on the independent contractor, but this might very well be carried out within employment. So linking payment to completion of tasks places the risk of inefficiency on the worker, and I think this will we will see this to a larger extent. I also think we will see an increased focus on profit sharing again, and different models of share ownership and profit-related pay. And again, when the worker's pay depends on company profits, the worker assumes a risk for inefficiency and is incentivized to provide a fair return on sort of the salary or the remuneration. And this is fundamentally different as compared to how we today measure and remunerate work within employment. Again, I definitely think that this can be carried out within employment, but we will see a shift on these two respects. Turning then to the boundaries of labor law, which is the hot topic today in relation to the gig economy and so on. And now I hear that we have algorithms who have solved this issue. I mean, but still. So a few remarks about that. I agree with authors to this paper that the normal market for human labor creates opportunities for exploitation, for sure. The importance of work for the individual worker supersedes the risk to the company of losing a particular worker or gaining a particular worker. So there is a need for a particular law besides ordinary contract law, and that we could probably in the future also call labor law or employment law. I again agree with authors that equal parties have no responsibility for each other beyond their own contractual agreements. If you want a contract for just cause termination or some kind of fees in relation to that, sure, go ahead. But that should not be provided for by mandatory law. But when we have unequal parties, there is a need for protection. Again, I agree with authors. And what we need to do then is to update the idea of inequality and need for protection. And I suggest that we return to older discussions about financial dependence and integration into to the company as two possibly fruitful venues for updating the notion of inequality. Obviously, this needs to be done with sensitivity to the fact that nowadays we are operating with platforms and online communication and so on. So integration into a company might not, so you might not necessarily have to be there to be integrated in a company. I think that we should legislate on criteria for inclusion in protective legislation. Sweden famously has no law on the concept of employee. But I think there's a democratic impetus for not leaving it entirely to courts themselves to intervene in economic relations. So the boundaries of protective legislation, I argue, ought to be set by the legislator in clear and foreseeable and relevant criteria. So you shouldn't need an algorithm to understand the law. You should be able to sort of understand it yourself. No? Or at least after consulting a lawyer and paying that fee. But sure, no algorithm, huh? Or economists. Huh? I think the Swedish experience, when it comes to the third category, is that it is a success story because it bolsters the protection of employees. This incentivizes employers from using independent contract workers, because there's less money to be made from that shift. So you instead use the labor law legislation and you hire workers as employees. But the Swedish model then is about allowing independent workers or dependent contractors, depending on what side of the coin you're looking at, to bargain collectively, to form a cartel, if you will, and so on. But they're not part of employment protection schemes and so on. Yeah. I think that the fragmentation of the employer needs to be met with laws on joint and several responsibility for all employers' obligations. Otherwise, you might get ahead just from you would be able to make money from fragmenting your company into a number of entities and contracting around work on that way. So you would get an unfair advantage. And this could easily be met with laws on joint and several responsibility for employers' obligations, which is already found in many statute books around the world in different respects. And my parting words will be some additional points for new policy infrastructure that sort of would be in line with what's already in the paper. So this is not about disagreeing, but sort of adding more of the same then. First of all, I want to raise the question, is there a danger in bifurcation in labor law? So we would have one set of labor law for global remote workers, and one set of laws for the old boring university teachers that are sort of stuck to Sweden and to the actual sort of place where we stand. So and the obvious point is that remote workers need services performed on site. You need your food or your children to be taken care of, or you want to grow old perhaps, and someone needs to take care about you and so on. So production of goods and on-site services are still immensely important also in this new economy. So there's a danger in bifurcation that we need to think more about. I also think we should adopt a life cycle perspective on the regulation of work. We should start thinking about already education, on-job training, obviously when we are at work, but also retirement and dependence on pensions. That needs to be taken into account when we define labor law. I think we need to update work-life balance rules, which not least with the right to disconnect, so that you can actually have time off, also when you're a global remote worker. I think there's a need to strengthen employees' rights to privacy. This could be done in human rights instruments, or in collective bargaining agreement, or in law. When the work site is your home, there is a need to rethink the boundary between public and private, because you're sort of in somewhere in between when you're working from home. I think we need to skip out the criteria or the idea that surveillance and control is sort of defining of employee status. That is so easily done away with. You can have an algorithm to surveillance workers, or you can have a technical system for that. And it's super cheap, and it's entirely irrelevant for defining either category, either the dependent, the contractor, or the employee. Well, I think we see new health and safety issues in remote work. I'm quoting the United Nations, who sort of succinctly says that home is the most dangerous place for women and girls. So it's more dangerous than being at a factory then. So we need to update also health and safety laws, and I know the ILO is working on this in a recent convention and so on. But this is an important issue if we're going to steer employment or work to the home. This needs to be dealt with. If we're witnessing a problem of matching, finally, then well, we should also improve employment agency services to match supply and demand on the labor market. So we can do away with the situation where there's a labor shortage and unemployment at the same time. This challenge must be met also on national levels. And my final point is about transnational labor law, which has proven to be the most efficient mechanism for countering tendencies towards social dumping and any race to the bottom. So the more labor laws look the same in different jurisdictions, there is less need for maneuvering or trickery on part of employers, and workers will also know what to expect from their work. So this is my points from the labor lawyer's perspective, from the Swedish labor lawyer's perspective on your paper. So again, thank you for this very interesting read and the opportunity to tell you about my read of your work. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Niklas. What seems to be an additional topic to the seminar is the point of not being an economist. The next speaker is also known as surprisingly often introducing herself as, I'm not an economist. So here is Lotta Stern, who is a professor in sociology at Stockholm University, and she is also CEO of the Rådsjurist.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll do this. I'll start with pouring myself some water too. Well, I'm gonna do this a little differently than the previous speaker, and I'm gonna just focus on the Swedish labor market. That's what I know of. That's my kind of lovely topic of research. So here we go. I'll start by sort of reintroducing the competition for talent problem that we are facing in Sweden. For as long as I can remember, we've been talking about how hard it is for employers to find talent and how hard it is to fill open positions with ready, scheduled, competent people. And of course, this is a problem for a country that wants to grow and expand and be a dynamic place, because you can't, grow. If you can't have people doing your task, you will not grow. But human capital, as the economists call human beings, there's a lot of economic cracks here, sorry Fredrik, is actually very hard to trade. There's all kinds of issues that makes human capital not that easy to sort of just ship around the world. One of them is, of course, language, culture, and skills. We are a small country. We're about 10 million people who speak a very strange language that no one else except a small minority in Finland understands. And of course, just moving here and filling the gaps will not be that fast and easy. We have national rules for occupational licensing that makes it so that if you're a plumber, you might not be able to be a plumber in Sweden if you don't match our certification structure. this is not a big deal in Sweden. According to Morten Blick's sort of European Union going through these kinds of licensing, this is not a big problem in Sweden, but it is internationally. We are facing labor migration restrictions in Sweden as we speak, which will have an effect on how hard it is going to be to sort of match skills and work openings. So, here we are. And so this, of course, is an interesting problem, interesting thing. We are now facing a situation where these new HR platforms that I'm going to talk about, or call them, are providing this kind of new market. They're solving a problem that has been previously very difficult to solve. And they're doing it by using digitalization, of course, because these are only workers that can actually provide their work from anywhere, right? We've talked about multinationals doing this, like Twitter and Spotify, basically saying you don't need to ever come into the office again if you don't want to. We have digital nomads, a marginal phenomenon, but still, who wouldn't want to be one? Here's on my screen here is like Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Azores, Bali. Yeah, look out the window. I'm just saying. It's the 1st of November, people. Things are getting rough. So we will not be digital nomad country. That's, I think, we can all agree on. The HR intermediation service in this capacity is actually very interesting because it could be a way to match skills over the long run if it starts working effectively. I don't think it's going to be like humongous, but I think it might be interesting for particular workers. And I also want to actually point out something that has not been raised so far, but that is actually relevant from a migration point. And that is, of course, that there's a debate in migration research whether or not the brain drain from the global south is a problem for the global south and its development. And I think that if we think about that, some people say that they send back remittances and so it sort of levels out because they get resources back even if smart people move to other countries. I think it's a very interesting idea that we can have global workers who stay in their home countries and actually have, an opportunity to, contribute to the world where they are at. So if I'm sort of lifting myself out of the Swedish context for a second, I think this is also actually something that's worth talking about. I couldn't help to notice that Sweden, of course, is rank 117 among digital nomads, and too cold is the issue. Yeah, I had that already figured out. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the concept of digital workers and do so a little bit from a broader perspective. Because I want to sort of intervene and say also, there are new platforms. They match people digitally, and it's a very interesting new way of using technology to organize work. So I think we have a genuinely new way of organizing work. It's made possible by new technology, and it provides complications for the Swedish labor market model because we're facing something that we haven't actually seen before. And some of the examples, of course, have already been mentioned. The gig workers finding gigs via platforms, but we also have the self-employed who find their gigs and can actually, in a very easy way, invoice and make, sort of be a contractor without actually having to deal with the hassle of being a contractor. And so, they're here to stay. I am of the opinion that they're actually quite interesting. Samuel is talking about the employer of record, and this is a very sort of new way, at least for me. I'm an organizational sociologist. I haven't really dealt with this issue before. And what is really interesting is that you have national employer of records and workers. right? They're in Sweden. But you know, the contract or the customer company is actually anywhere else. I don't think we've had this that much in the world previously, and so this I think is actually a game changer and a very interesting thing of thinking about this. Anyway, to go back to what does this imply? Well, I think that what it usually implies is that there's a whole bunch of tension created around these new ways of organizing work. And in Sweden at least, they tend to be marginalized. We've seen it with platforms, we've seen it with gig work. People don't like these new ways of organizing work. And I think that we need to actually think about other innovations that we have seen in the Swedish labor markets. And I think one of the most important ones were temp agencies. They were made legal in the 1990s. I'm old enough to remember how hated they were, right? I followed the organizational sociologists and their studies on precarity and you know, they were not included in the workplace. They didn't get any on-the-job training. There was all kinds of issues with these kinds of platforms. I think we all realize today that, you know, they're here to stay. We have learned a lot by having them in the labor market, not least because, you know, we have a Swedish model in place. They created an employer association, they signed collective agreements, but also the people who use temp agency workers learned to be more inclusive, learned to work with them in a professional way. There are, of course, HR organizations in these, you know, customer companies that will take care of people. They want to take care of people. And so I do think that that's an interesting comparison, okay? What they also did that I think is an interesting idea is that they created a certification organization. They, in a very sort of typical Swedish model way, did that together with the unions. So you can now become a temporary agency company and have your certification, and you know, that way, as a customer company, you know they're up to snuff, and you can trust that they are not a bad company in any way. So you know, there are developments. They're new. They're, you know, controversial, but then over time, they will be here to stay, and we will learn to deal with this. Why am I telling you this? Because I think it is important that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater here. I think these new innovative ways of organizing work should be allowed, treated with respect. We should complain about them when they don't, you know, when they don't work well. But you know, that's part of the process. And you know, I don't think that the employer of record is going to be humongous, but neither are the temporary agency workers. I mean, when they became legal in the 1990s, people were saying like, oh, we're not going to have employment anymore in the future because everyone's going to be a temper, and you know, throw in, throw out. And that hasn't happened. They're about 2% of the labor force. That's what I would predict that employer of record companies are going to have as their market share too. But what do I know? I'm just saying, they contribute to the productive and growth of Sweden, even though they're not a huge phenomenon. So, what about the employer of record in the Swedish model? Well, the Swedish model is based on collective agreements. And will this model work for these kinds of agencies? Well, I'm not sure. There's several complications. They're going to have a variety of workers and skills. Are they going to have like a collective agreement for each and every one of them? Sounds complicated. Will the customer company go on board with this? I mean, you know, they have their packages, they have their ideas of what benefits to offer workers, etc. Will they think that the Swedish model is attractive? I don't know. Maybe there's going to be very, very important trade-offs. We were talking about profit sharing. That's not covered with the collective agreements. But maybe these global workers are more interested in having profit sharing as part of their contract than they are about red days and work time, other stuff that is regulated in collective agreements. So I do think that it's going to be complicated to sort of organize these kinds of companies in the typical Swedish model way. And so I think the Swedish model needs to actually step up and adjust. I don't think the solution is to squeeze these companies into the Swedish model. So one interesting wrinkle in this is that they, of course, challenge sort of the traditional employer-employee norm, and that's what Samuel was talking about. They are somewhat in between, and who's actually the employer, it's not clear. And the same, of course, goes with the platform workers. It's clear that these non-standard worker arrangement is on the rise. I mean, they're becoming more and more common with these new platform great things, and it's a huge innovation process, I think. I mean, we're going to see more and more interesting wrinkles in these kinds of ideas. And I think forcing them into the model might be unproductive because of stifling that type of innovation, which could potentially hurt Sweden's competitiveness. So I think that one of my ideas here is that we need to allow for this kind of dynamism and change. And so, in terms of the Swedish model and how the Swedish model are going to have to, figure these types of organizations into their equation, is that I think we need to focus on what is important. And I think important for the employees and important for the people who are actually providing the work. And here I think letting go of some of the this is our collective agreement and this is what it looks like, and we have negotiated this over 25, 30 years, and we don't, we love them. I think that has to go. So I think that perhaps we will need collective agreements that actually allow for trade-offs, that actually allow for, I'd rather do the profit sharing than this. I'd rather do this than that. I'm not a part of the Swedish partner model, so I can't, but this is just how I see that things should be going, to make it attractive also in the future, so to speak. How about the role of the union representative in this country, in this kind of organization? I don't really know, because I think it's already kind of difficult, and the unions must find a new way of representing these kinds of workers, I think. Because I don't really think they're going to be members of unions. I don't really, and if they are, they're not going to be members of the same unions. So, that's another one. The other interesting wrinkle is actually something that is mentioned in Samuel's paper, and it has to do with this sort of dichotomy between, you're either an employee or you're a contractor. And I think that it's a really interesting idea to start thinking about this not as a dichotomy but as a continuum, or like a 4 categories thing or something, where you can actually be an employee, you can be a semi-independent employee, you can be a semi-dependent contractor, you can be an independent contractor, but actually allow for a variety of different roles rather than just having 2 and forcing people into these 2 roles. I think that would be a real step forward. And again, I think it's very important to focus on what is important. For these kinds of things, occupational pensions, work environment issues, I mean, there's obvious things where the Swedish model can and will contribute to making these workers better off. But today we have a situation where platform organizations are afraid to offer benefits to their platform workers, because then the legislator is going to come at them and say, "You're an employer," right? So if you're a gig company and you want to actually give gig workers good equipment, range things, the government is going to come and say, well, since you're taking on this responsibility for the people who work for your platform, you're an employer and we're going to force you to be treated as an employer. I don't think that's a fruitful way forward. I think we need to sort of acknowledge that they're here to stay, they're a legitimate part of the labor market, and go for that. And then, of course, you can think of the Swedish model certification process here. I think for the platforms it is very interesting to think that they can actually be encouraged to self-regulate in a sort of similar manner that the employer agencies have done and continue to do. Those were my food for thoughts in the future, people. And oh yeah, here are some of the aspects of what I think is important for workers. Anyway, I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Laura. And with that, it's time for the Economist Revenge. Fredrik Sjöholm, professor in economics at Lund University, and you are also the CEO of the Research Institute of Industrial Economics, or EFN.
Not Lund University anymore. No.
Not Lund
No,
University. Sorry.
Only EFN.
Only EFN. Well,
Thank you.
You still
Yes.
have the accent. Sorry.
I still have the accent. Not in English, I hope. Yes, so I'm the economist here, and that means I don't know much about the labor laws, the labor regulations, but maybe a few things about what's driving this development of globalization of the labor market, and maybe also about what it means for Sweden's society and economy. And I think, as Lotta pointed out, there are different aspects here of this global work. I mean, we have what we have read about, I think, throughout the year in Swedish the newspapers is these nomads, the ones that goes to these beautiful places and they work often for Swedish companies, other times for international companies, very rarely for the local companies where they stay. And they typically work on this kind of contract as contract workers. It's growing, as we've heard, but it's still, I would say, a marginal phenomenon, at least in Sweden. It starts growing from a very low level. So in sheer numbers, these workers are still quite few. But then, of course, we have the other type of global workers or globalization of the labor market, the offshoring thing. And that is something that has been going on for decades in Swedish firms, where multinational firms or Swedish firms in general, they decide to outsource part of their economic activities. So for a long time that was manufacturing. So all the Swedish firms, they started to produce parts and inputs in other countries, or maybe put the final product together in other countries. The new thing here is that in the last 10, 15 years or so, we have seen that it's a lot of services that are being outsourced, and that really relates to these whole discussions about the type of workers that we see doing contract work. So Swedish companies are increasingly outsourcing services to other countries. Okay, they can do that by having their own factories or their own offices in foreign countries, or by using foreign firms and sometimes foreign workers. But even here, I would say that the contract worker is not the dominant part of this offshoring. It's much more common that you actually approach foreign firms for some types of services. So how is this going to be developed in the future? Is it going to increase? Why is it happening? And it's going to increase. And I think it's really, this is part of globalization. Okay? So if we want to make some kind of prediction how this is going to look in the future, it might be good to take a step back and think about what drives globalization. What is it that has been driving globalization for the last decades? And there are really two important things here. Okay? The first one is that there need to be what we can call political will. That countries want to engage in trade and other types of global engagements. Okay? And the other one is that they should have the capabilities to do so. Okay? Should be able to transport trade and services over borders. And if we look at the political will, it was for decades the case that the governments became more and more engaged in and more and more positive towards global engagement. Okay? After, let's say in the 50s, there were still countries trying to with import substitution. That is that you try to achieve competitive industries by protecting them for foreign competition, high tariffs, subsidies, and so forth. It didn't work. Okay, it never became competitive. So from the 60s and forward, and especially I would say in late 80s or the 90s, most countries kind of dismantled trade tariffs and other non-tariff barriers and so forth, and became more and more outward oriented. And this was kind of enhanced by the emergence of global institutions like the WTO, the European Union, and many similar kind of arrangements. But that has come to a stop. That has come to a stop. So we have seen in the last 10 years or so that the political will has totally changed, and countries have become much more, all the big economies have become much more inward oriented. So if you take China, at least since the 2015 with the launch of the Made in China policy, which really says that they will try to be less dependent on the world and try to produce strategic goods themselves and don't have to rely on imports. And look at export as a share of GDP in China has gone from 35% to 17%, halved in 10 years or so. If you look at US, as we know, when President Trump comes to power, first day in office, he kind of withdraws from the trade negotiations in the Pacific. He launches the trade war with China, and also with some friendly allies like in Europe and Canada and Mexico and so forth, Korea. And of course, it's also notable that President Biden, when he gets into office, he doesn't change anything of this. Okay, but what he does is to launch the IRA that you might have heard about, the climate package. And I think most of the world welcome these climate activities, that the US is back in the work against climate change. But the IRA, it kind of subsidizes green tech production and non-fossil electricity generation. The problem is that you have to produce it in the US with US inputs, otherwise you don't get subsidies. So it's kind of difficult for foreign competitors. So what happens in Europe? We do the same thing. Okay, we have the Net Zero Act and many of these type of big industry projects where European Union should identify promising industries, batteries, solar cells, and so forth, and then subsidize them to become competitive. So I said it's political will and it's technology. The political will is definitely not for more globalization. It's much more inward looking now all over the world. But, and in particular for this type of workers that Sam was so nicely talking about, there's another aspect here, and that's the technology change. And that's going to balance, I think, this political development. Because what happens in technology is that you see such rapid progresses there that it becomes constantly more easy to offshore, in particular service sector jobs. I think Lotta mentioned the barriers with languages, but there are programs now that I can speak my South Swedish, and it will be translated to Swedish for you, immediately in real time, so we can understand each other like this, or to Swahili or to Portuguese or whatever languages. And you have all of these kind of technology developments that really makes it easier. So I think in manufacturing, what we see is more of a regionalization of the supply lines. But I think in services, we haven't seen that so far. So I think this is going to continue this development of the globalization of the labor market, and also what you call the global worker and contract worker and so forth. What does that mean for a country like Sweden? Well, of course, it's globalization. We know when you have more globalization, there is a convergence of wages, for instance. Okay, so Swedish engineer will have roughly the same wage as an Indian engineer or Belgian engineer or a US engineer. That's one trend. There's another aspect here also of globalization that will affect these wages, and that is, well, if we think about why have Swedes have had historically relatively good wages? Well, one thing is that we have been good in some sense, well trained or highly educated. And the other aspect is that we have had good technologies to work with. The Swedish firms have developed sophisticated technologies that increases our productivity, which increases our wages. Okay, but globalization also means that this technology that is being developed in Sweden is being used all over the world. It's so easy to transfer technology over the world into factories all over the world. So that advantages is by year kind of disappearing. So for future kind of high wages in Sweden, we will have to rely on training, education, and things like that we are good, so to speak, if we don't want to have Chinese wages. Another aspect is, what does this contract worker and also forth mean for inequality? Well, again, here is the technology aspect, I think, important, which both enables this outsourcing of service sector jobs and trade and services, but in itself also has an impact on demand for different occupations, tasks, and skills. So there's both the trade part here that will affect the inequalities, and the technology part that will affect inequalities, both by affecting trade and by affecting demand for different skills. And historically, new technologies have often increased wage inequality. Okay, so if you look at automatization, or when you look at when we got robots into our factories, that typically replaced people at the, let's say, lower middle part of the wage distribution. So it kind of increased wage inequality. We have now research at IFN where we look at the effect of digitalization. And it's really super, I think, very interesting to see that typically replaces people much higher up in the wage distribution. So this is actually, the digitalization is actually kind of decreasing wage inequalities. We also have the whole thing about, which we talked about here, both Samuel and Lotta and Niklas, about the AI and development of that. And we see similar trends there. There is, take ChatGPT, which is so new, so it's difficult to evaluate, but there are some new papers done by other researchers in the US that look at the effect of ChatGPT on productivity and on wages. And what they find is that they look at middle managers, and they look what happens when you get ChatGPT. Well, it increases productivity for everyone, but it actually increases productivity more for relatively worse middle managers. So it kind of levels the productivity levels between different middle managers in this case. So that kind of also again kind of decreases wage dispersion. So yeah, I think I should kind of stop here. But yes, I really appreciated, or I really enjoyed reading your paper on these global workers. I certainly learned a lot. I think there are so many different implications of this, both in terms of labor legislations and so forth, that I don't know anything about, but I with great interest listen to what you had to say about that. And also, how it's going to impact, offshoring, service trade, and thereby growth of Sweden, wages of different occupations, and so forth. So I think we're going to discuss these issues in many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I believe we need some coffee and some air at the moment. So I'll ask you to, in a while, raise up, shake it off, grab some coffee, we'll open some windows, and then we'll be back in, say, 5-7 minutes for the panel session. And then as a way to conclude this seminar, we'll ask Samuel and Lotta to conclude and make some reflections. So, fika! Nu kör vi! Det är dags att prata svenska, så jag säger välkomna tillbaka. Det blev en kort kafferast. Ni får gärna hjälpa mig stänga fönstret så slipper vi Sveavägen. Och nu ska vi prata lite mer koncentrerat om Sverige och svenska modellen, svenska arbetsmarknaden, hur den påverkas av vad vi nu har hört från forskarna. Och för att göra det så ska vi prata med Magnus Hedberg som är VD på Akavia. Einar Humlin som är förhandlingschef på Tech Sverige, också styrelseledamot i Sveriges HR-förening. Och Jens Nordqvist som är, ja du har en engelsk titel, Vice MD and Head of People and Performance and Academic Work. Så bemanningsföretag. Så välkomna upp! Nu gissar jag på att ni har mycket som ni vill ha sagt, men jag vill egentligen börja med att fråga er vad ni säger om hur stor är den globala arbetsmarknaden? Hur ser det ut för er? Ni kommer från lite olika fält men ganska närliggande varandra. Om jag frågar dig Einar först.
Den är ju för techsektorn i Sverige och globalt är den ju enorm. Det finns inga begränsningar på det sättet. Så att det är en spännande tid och en spännande utveckling som vi verkligen befinner oss i.
Tack. Och Magnus, global arbetsmarknad för Akavia.
Våra medlemmar är ju typiskt sett akademiker som verkar inom juridik och ekonomi och olika typer av samhällsvetenskaper. Så att för dem är det här ingen nyhet. Den globala arbetsmarknaden har funnits sedan tidigare. Många av våra medlemmar har eller kommer att arbeta ur ett globalt perspektiv. Så att på så sätt så är det inte något nytt. Det som är intressant är ju att det utvecklas väldigt snabbt och att förutsättningen att göra det kommer att skifta framöver. Men själva internationaliseringen och globaliseringen, den är ett fenomen som vi känner sedan tidigare.
Och Jens slutligen, du kommer från ett bemanningsföretag.
Ja precis. Nej men det är ju lite som gänget säger här. Det är ju en oändlig bas av människor att plocka av. Men det finns massa utmaningar med det också.
Jag tänkte, 2 av er har ju ett tydligt arbetsgivarperspektiv. Hur ser ni på möjligheten att låta anställda jobba från var som helst i världen? Elina börjar.
Nej, men våra medlemsföretag, det är 1400 bolag, det är 100 000 anställda i Sverige. Det är klart man ser positivt på att man kan sitta någon annanstans och jobba men också samarbeta med andra människor från andra länder. Det är ju en fantastisk möjlighet. Samtidigt måste man ju respektera de utmaningar vi har pratat om. Arbetsmiljöfrågorna, ledarskapsfrågorna, villkorsfrågor. Men det är ju framförallt de svenska villkoren. Och vad händer om du skickar någon till Kanarieöarna i 2 månader? Då måste du tänka på vad händer om du blir sjuk? Du ska respektera någon som blir föräldraledig. Så det är ju sådana praktiska frågor. Det finns inte jättemycket av det här gig-inslaget i techsektorn på det sättet att man inte har någon riktig, liksom, antingen ett avtal med en leverantör som levererar en service. Eller så har du egna anställda som liksom utför dina arbeten. Det är sällan det här andra fenomenet mittemellan just i den här sektorn. Vilket kan ha att göra med att marknaden är så pass het nu. Man måste liksom organisera det här. Plus säkerhetsfrågorna. Det har vi inte pratat om. Idag är det jättemånga företag som har säkerhetsklassificeringar på alla anställda. Du får inte ens logga in i en dator. Du får inte vara provanställd ens om du inte uppfyller vissa kriterier som sätts av andra. Det är lagstiftningen. Och det i sig är ju naturligtvis en utmaning. Hur ska vi hantera det? Och det oroliga säkerhetsläget i världen gör ju inte saken bättre. Det är något som oroar. Och kanske hindrar mer från att man öppnar upp liksom dammluckorna fullständigt här.
Jens, har du andra perspektiv här?
Nej men vi har ju flera tusen konsulter ute hos massa olika kundföretag varenda dag. Och det ser ju naturligtvis väldigt annorlunda eller olika ut beroende på vad det är för bolag. Vissa är ju superöppna för att ha medarbetare på distans, alltså helt och hållet. Och många vill ha folk nära sig.
Nu har vi pratat om era bolag som är ganska internationella, som tänker internationellt, men vi har ju också en väldigt svensk arbetsmarknad. Vad säger Magnus? Hur påverkar det här, alltså hur påverkar global arbetsmarknad den svenska arbetsmarknaden?
Ja, men det påverkar. Det är ju helt uppenbart att arbetsmarknaden är ju stadd i en snabb förändring. Jag tycker att den här rapporten visar det på ett väldigt tydligt sätt. Sen ska man ju såklart ha perspektiven klara för sig, precis som vi var inne på tidigare. Det här är ingen revolution på kort sikt, det tror jag inte man kan säga. Men självklart så kommer det att ha betydelse på lite längre sikt och vi vet att de finns här redan idag och därmed så står vi här och pratar om det. Jag tror att det som är absolut viktigast här, det är ju att vi har ett perspektiv av att hela tiden prata och fundera på vad ställer det här för krav på den svenska arbetsmarknadsmodellen. Det faktum att vi ser en föränderlig arbetsmarknad. Och jag tror att några sådana förändringar är ju tydliga och det handlar till exempel om att vi behöver fundera över hur ska vi framöver relatera till den här typen av arbetstagare. Vi har pratat om det här arbetstagarbegreppet. Vi vet att det finns på europeisk nivå en diskussion om detta. behöver vi också reflektera över här hemma. Jag tror att vi som parter, både som arbetstagarparter som jag representerar och arbetsgivarparterna, vi behöver fundera på hur kan vår framgångsrika modell med det vi kallar den svenska arbetsmarknadsmodellen med kollektivavtal, hur kan den appliceras på den här typen av arbete framöver? För jag tror ju att det finns goda förutsättningar att faktiskt jobba med att utveckla den svenska modellen till att också kunna inkorporera den här typen av arbete framöver.
Och vad behöver göras då?
Ja, vi behöver, som Lotta var inne på, tror jag, reflektera över hur våra kollektivavtal ser ut. Mitt förbund har ju, menar jag, ofta gått i bräschen för att vi vill hitta liksom relevanta sätt att teckna kollektivavtal och fundera på vad är liksom nästa steg. Så att vi inte fastnar i en särskild form. Vi vet att det är en väldigt klok idé att arbeta på det sättet som vi har gjort inom ramen för den svenska modellen med kollektivavtal. Det är smart, det leder till välbefinnande och det innebär massor med positiva effekter. Men hur kan vi då se till att det smarta sättet att organisera regleringarna på arbetsmarknaden, att det kan omfatta även den här typen av arbete, och hur exakt det ska gå till, det tror jag ingen har svaret på här. Men vi behöver prata med varandra och vi behöver vara öppna för att också göra justeringar, för att ingen modell är så bra att den inte behöver hela tiden ses över med jämna mellanrum.
Då bollar jag över till motparten då. Vad säger du? Vad behöver göras?
Nej, men vi är helt överens.
Ja.
Jag menar, vi har ju 2 kollektivavtal för techsektorn idag, ett IT och ett telekom. De bejakar möjligheterna. Det är väldigt stor flexibilitet och väldigt moderna och uppdaterade som de är idag. Men det här fenomenet måste vi diskutera mellan parterna. Det är ingenting som vi kan ensidigt säga att det ska vara si eller så, utan vi har en bra och nära dialog om det här. Det här löser vi tillsammans. Och helt i enlighet med den svenska modellen. Vi vill inte ha regleringar som någon annan skickar utifrån andras förutsättningar, vilket man kan ha stor respekt för. Men vi vill ha ju våra förutsättningar och vi vill ju diskutera dem utifrån vår tradition som är över 100 år gammal. Och this is the land of the collective agreements. So let us keep it that way. Så det är ett sätt för oss att lösa det. Är så. Och vi vill gärna fortsätta med det.
Men om jag då frågar, om man sätter svenska modellen i någon slags internationell konkurrenskraftsperspektiv, är den svenska modellen det som kommer överleva om vi liksom börjar aktivt ha konkurrens mellan olika arbetsmarknadssystem?
En intressant spaning är ju att titta på hur det ser ut i Europa. Det är ju den liksom närmaste kontexten vi kan ändå röra oss i. Och där kan man ha mycket synpunkter på att reglera saker på EU-nivå när det handlar om arbetsmarknad. I det svenska perspektivet så är vi inte alltid särskilt glada över det. Men jag tycker att det finns något väldigt positivt. Dels att man förstår att det här är frågor som behöver lösas, inte bara i ett enskilt land, utan vi behöver lösa det tillsammans i Europa. Och även om vi ser problem med till exempel ta det minimilönedirektiv som har varit väldigt uppmärksammat i Sverige på senare tid, så är det ju uttalat ifrån EU att man säger att det vi allra helst hade önskat, det vore att arbetsmarknaden hade fungerat i enlighet med den svenska modellen. Hade alla EU-länder haft den typen av modell som man har i Sverige, så hade det här varit en icke-fråga. Och man har försökt komma fram till att hitta olika typer av vägar att inte påverka den svenska modellen negativt. Det är ett ganska starkt, tycker jag, betyg att vi faktiskt ligger i framkant. Och precis som Einar säger, jag har i alla fall inte, även om det kan låta självgott, hittat bättre exempel på att reglera arbetsmarknaden mera flexibelt, mera i linje med de förändringar som hela tiden dyker upp, än mellan 2 parter i en smidig dialog, snarare än via liksom politiska beslut och regleringar och göra det här till en liksom statlig angelägenhet. Jag tror mycket mer att vår modell är lättare att applicera i den här typen av föränderlig arbetsmarknad som vi lever i.
Det ser ut som att Einar också vill säga någonting.
Ja, men säg gärna något. Vi har 1400 medlemsföretag idag. Många är globala företag. De har internationella organisationer. De tittar över sina avtalsregler. Och alla kan växa och vara snabbfotade och fungera väldigt väl i Sverige. Vi har globala företag som prioriterar Sverige som land för att ha det som bas för en del i sin globala verksamhet. Och det är någonting som jag menar är ett kvitto på att den svenska modellen fungerar och levererar. Därför att vi kan lösa problemen tillsammans. Vi undviker konflikter. Jag har också blivit inbjuden att föreläsa inom ramen för den sociala dialogen för andra länders företrädare för olika sektorer. Och de frågar, hur lyckas ni här? Men det är vår tradition, det börjar där. Vår tradition att lösa frågor genom partssystemet utan politisk inblandning. Det är det som är en av nycklarna. Om de stora globala företagen kan utveckla sin IT eller techverksamhet i Sverige, jag menar det tycker jag är det bästa betyget vi kan få. Och det ska vi förvalta mycket väl, tycker jag. Det arbetet är vi stolta över och vi ska utveckla det fortsatt.
Jag vill ställa en till fråga till er och sen ska Jens få komma in igen. Vad betyder det här för förhandlingspositioner för fack respektive arbetsgivare om företag kan säga men då går vi via någon annan istället? Påverkar det?
Det är ju en förutsättning som vi alla lever med. Jag menar, det är klart att för 20 år sedan när IT-branschen i Sverige inte var organiserad, det är den idag i en helt annan omfattning. Då är det klart att det fanns en risk, tror jag, om de fackliga organisationerna inte hade sett, herregud, här kommer allting läggas utanför Sveriges gränser om inte vi hittar lösningar tillsammans. Det påverkar i den riktningen. Samtidigt så har vi ju arbetsgivare som vill ha personal som vaknar upp på morgonen och kommer till företaget och tycker det här är en karriär jag vill satsa på. Vi är liksom beroende av varandra. Så är det inte bara i IT-branschen, så är det även i traditionell industri. Eller i andra industrier, men vi kompletterar varandra. Vi är ju inte konkurrenter, vi är ju ett maskineri som gynnar Sverige och vi ska skapa tillväxt för Sverige som land och alla som verkar här. Så att det skapar en balans på något sätt. Det är inte den osynliga handen, men något i den stilen kanske. Det skapar i alla fall en tillvaro som vi får förhålla oss till och respektera.
Vill Magnus också kommentera något?
Nej, instämmer med mig.
Ja, det är väldigt sams.
Det är den svenska modellen.
Men då tänkte jag fråga Jens.
Ja.
Bemanningsföretagen, bemanningsbranschen, ni utmanade modellen, det var som Lotta sa, eller ni utmanade idén om modellen. Finns det likheter idag om man tittar på anställningsformer som Samuel var inne på?
Ja, och jag tror liksom det viktiga, liksom Lotta var inne på här, det viktiga är ju inte att blunda för det här fenomenet. Vi behöver ju se det för vad det är. Det finns massa utmaningar och massa möjligheter. Och jag tror, som vi har varit inne på nu flera gånger, alltså bara vi pratar om det här och vidare framåt så tror jag vi kommer kunna lösa jättemycket. Och sen tror inte vi kanske att det här är, ja det är ett fenomen som är här, men alltså utifrån, jag är ute och pratar med massor av våra kunder, det vanligaste är ju återigen, man vill ha sin personal nära sig. Kan man välja så vill man ha sina medarbetare ganska nära. Det är i alla fall det vi får höra. Och det hänger ihop med, grunden är ju att ett gap mellan vad det finns för kompetenser och efterfrågan. Och det är ju kanske mer ett utbildningsstrukturellt fenomen, problem och utmaning som vi har en väg att vandra i Sverige.
Om vi backar bandet lite nu. Kronan är ganska svag. Finns det risk för brain drain istället då? Att svenska arbetstagare som redan är en knapp resurs då väljer att liksom sitta kvar här men jobba för internationella företag?
Absolut, det tror jag. Det tror jag verkligen. Det är bara att kolla på Sverige och Norge, hur det har sett ut.
Ja, hur hanterar vi det då?
Ja, ett uppenbart det är att vi behöver vara konkurrenskraftiga naturligtvis i hur vi belönar nyckelmedarbetare och personer som är viktiga här i Sverige. Och vi tycker ju att det är viktigt att man hela tiden håller ett öga på hur det ser ut internationellt och att vi har en liksom konkurrenskraftig situation, absolut. Sen tror jag att det finns andra saker än bara också lönenivåer som spelar in. Jag menar, vi hörde det apropå att det finns klimatfaktorer som kan tala emot att vi lockar personer till Sverige. Men det finns ju också andra faktorer som är viktiga, återigen, som är beroende av det system som vi har byggt upp. Ta till exempel när vi ser att forskare gärna kommer faktiskt till Sverige. Vi har ett ganska stort inflöde av internationella studenter. Jag tror inte i första hand att de kommer för vädret, men de kommer för väldigt mycket av den svenska samhällsmodellen som är väldigt attraktiv. Det finns till exempel goda förutsättningar att skaffa barn i Sverige. Vi har en generös föräldraförsäkring. Vi har en väl utbyggd välfärd. Och det är också saker som spelar in när det handlar om attraktiviteten i hur det är att leva och verka i ett land. Så att jag tror att man behöver se det här ur ett lite större perspektiv där vi också har många positiva faktorer pullfaktorer som talar för Sverige. Men naturligtvis så behöver vi hela tiden se till att vi belönar de medarbetare som sitter på viktig kompetens på ett bra sätt i Sverige också för att undvika brain drain.
Ejna ska få komma in, men jag tänkte också säga att om ni har några publikfrågor så passa på att vifta så kommer vi gå runt med en mikrofon också. Jag vet att jag fick några inspel men ni kan lika gärna få ställa frågorna själva så ni är beredda på det. Så Einar, varsågod.
En svag krona är inget man eftersträvar i sig, men det är klart att så länge Sverige kan bli ett attraktivt land för investeringar, är andra länders företag eller vilka institutioner vill satsa på att utveckla en verksamhet i Sverige. Men vem man kunnat drömma om utvecklingen i Norrland för 25 år sedan? Inte många. Va? Så det är något positivt i sig. Det kommer innebära att vi får jobb här, vi kommer öka våra kvalifikationer, vi kommer vara mer gångbara i en konkurrenskraftig och konkurrenskraftiga i ett globalt perspektiv. Och om man vill veta lite grann hur ett globalt företag tänker, så kan jag rekommendera en bok. Jag är inte sponsrad på något sätt, men Spotifys HR-direktör Katarina Berg har skrivit en bok som heter Bold HR. Där står det precis om de här grejerna med globala anställningskontrakt och sånt där. Var det massor av utmaningar. Det kan man ju läsa om det man är intresserad.
Har vi några frågor så kanske Dennis kan hjälpa till med. Ja, Roger har en. Dennis kommer med mikrofon så kommer vi också höra på inspelningen.
Hej, Roger Mockvik har jobbat i fackliga världen och forskning och sociologi och nationalekonomi och möjligt de senaste 30 åren. Men jag skulle bara säga, det vi pratar om nu, det har ju skapat ett Sverige som har varit unikt. Vi har ju fått ett handslag mellan arbete och kapital, mellan marknad och politik, som har gett oss en låg konfliktnivå, strukturomvandling, hög produktivitet, tillväxt och makroekonomisk stabilitet på grund av lönebildning som funkar med vissa undantag under de senaste åren, som också gett reallöneökningar och konkurrenskraft. Det här handslaget är ju oerhört viktigt också för den demokratiska stabiliteten i ett land. Jag bara undrar, nu utifrån det vi har pratat om, hur viktigt är det att partsmodellen också har positiva effekter för viljan att kompromissa överhuvudtaget?
Jättebra. Har vi någon mer fråga så kan vi passa på när Dennis ändå är på språng. Nej. Då tar vi Rogers fråga. Varsågod.
Ja, om jag får börja
Försten ut.
Ja. Nej, men stor betydelse tror jag. Jag kan ju bara instämma i det Roger säger, för att där tror jag väldigt mycket att det har byggt väldigt mycket av den framgång som vi ser. Och precis som vi har pratat om tidigare, den svenska modellen är ju någonting som har hela tiden utvecklats över åren. Den har ju inte sett likadan ut hela tiden, utan den stora poängen är ju just att man har olika intressen och man sätter sig ner och så pratar man om saken och så kompromissar man och hittar en gemensam väg framåt utan att konflikta om saker. Och det tror jag har betytt mycket för hela det svenska samhällsbygget. Alltså den låg, i alla fall fram till nu, om man nu ska vara lite defatistisk här, men den låga graden av konflikt i samhället tror jag har haft stor betydelse för att arbetsmarknaden verkligen har förmått att lösa de här frågorna. Och min spaning är ju också nu att det vi ser inom politiken tycker jag är en oroväckande polarisering, där man går bort ifrån det här traditionellt svenska sättet att lösa saker och ting med ett handslag. Och där tycker jag faktiskt då att parterna har tagit ett ansvar för att se till att på ett viktigt samhällsområde, nämligen arbetsmarknaden, se till att kunna hitta lösningar och låsa upp de här konflikterna som många gånger tyvärr tycker jag accelererat inom politiken. Ta bara trygghetsöverenskommelsen, där vi ju hade en enorm politisk press att lösa en fråga i partssystemet och där man levererade. Vilket innebär både en ökad flexibilitet när det handlar om arbetsrättsliga regleringar, men framförallt också en möjlighet till reell omställning, där ju Sverige nu går från anställningstrygghet till omställningstrygghet, och där medarbetare faktiskt har unikt förmånliga förutsättningar att kunna liksom leva och verka och utvecklas i den nya arbetsmarknad och ekonomi som växer fram. Så där har ju faktiskt partssystemet gått före politiken, tycker jag. Så att som svar på frågan är ju att ja, det har stor betydelse för det svenska samhällslivet och kanske ännu mer betydelse nu.
Det är helt rätt, och Rogers fråga, det är helt relevant. Men den svenska modellen är sprungen ur en konfliktfylld värld. Alltså före 1906, när man enades första gången om den så kallade decemberkompromissen, då var det ju strejker i fabrikerna. Det var inte villkor som var resonabla, i vart fall inte med dagens mått. Och då löste man det tillsammans, man respekterade varandra och byggde upp ett system. 38 var samma sak. Det föregicks av strejker och konflikter. Och vem är vinnare på det då? Ingen. Och nu, industriavtalet har samma effekt. Nu har man tagit ansvar igen. Så det är ett bevis på att över 100 år har det här funkat. Utifrån svenska förutsättningar så funkar det. Så att, och det är så jag har jobbat med det här i över 25 år. Det är det första jag får lära mig. Du ska lösa problem med inte skapa konflikter. Annars kan du göra något annat. Väljer jag en annan strategi, vad är det då? Ja, men det är konflikten. Och då har vi inga vinnare. Och då ska man kunna prata med varandra, man ska lyssna och förstå varandra och argumentera. Det är det handlar om.
Och Jens, vad säger du?
Nej, jag har nog inte så mycket att tillägga just det. Jag håller med.
Då har jag en lite mer konkret fråga och sen ska vi börja summera lite. Och det handlar lite mer om HR och liksom själva arbetsplatsen och det kollegiala. Vad betyder liksom den möjligheten till det här globala distansarbetet för kultur och arbetsplats? Alltså, Einar och Jens, ni jobbar båda med HR rent titelmässigt. Så om Jens får börja med den här.
Precis. Nej men återigen, det finns jättestora möjligheter med det här. Men det finns också jättemycket utmaningar. Det tycker jag att vi ser också att kulturen är mer utmanande och bygga på den, utveckla den här känslan av gemenskap, göra det tillsammans när vi inte får ses. Och digitalt i all ära, det är fantastiskt, det skapar massa möjligheter men det ersätter inte det mänskliga mötet på något sätt. Det tycker jag att vi ser en utmaning och det ställer mycket högre krav på våra chefer.
Einar, vad säger du?
Jo, men så är det absolut. Ett nytt typ av ledarskap där man verkligen bryr sig om medarbetarna och skickar de signalerna och hela tiden har en löpande kontakt. Visar ett intresse, hur har du egentligen aktivt jobbat med att avlasta personer som upplevs vara stressade eller att det är någonting som inte verkar lira. Man måste ha helt andra känselspröt idag än vad man kanske kunde ha för 10 år sedan. Så det är det viktigaste att tänka på.
Och får jag fråga dig då, Magnus, är det fackliga perspektivet på den här frågan annorlunda?
Nej, alltså det här är en jätteviktig fråga. Vi har verkligen försökt att grunda bland våra medlemmar hur man ser på hybridarbetslivet, det flexibla arbetslivet. Och vi har fått ett supertydligt svar i alla undersökningar vi har gjort. Det här är otroligt värdefullt att kunna jobba på det här sättet. Det finns ett före och ett efter pandemin. Och det är verkligen så, 3 av 4 Akavia-medlemmar då, jurister, ekonomer, samhällsvetare, skulle inte ta ett jobb om det inte fanns möjlighet att jobba flexibelt idag. Över hälften skulle söka sig bort om den här flexibiliteten på det befintliga jobbet började naggas i kanten. Så det är helt uppenbart att det här är någonting som är väldigt välkommet och som ökar produktiviteten, apropå det vi har hört tidigare, är jag helt övertygad om. Men det finns precis de här 2 utmaningarna. Det är svårare att bygga en gemensam arbetsplatskultur, känna en samhörighet. Och jag tror också att även om produktiviteten gynnas så kan kreativiteten minska när inte man träffas i samma utsträckning. Även om det naturligtvis går att göra digitalt så uppstår en dynamik i rummet när man träffas fysiskt. Så det är det man får ha, tror jag, uppsikt på och jobba med hybrida former för att se till att det här ska fungera både för arbetsgivare och för arbetstagare som uppenbart uppskattar den här nya flexibiliteten och hybrida arbetslivet, åtminstone våra medlemmar.
Ett inflik där, jag tycker också vi ser, precis som du säger, att medarbetare vill ju gärna ha flexibiliteten och arbetsgivare tycker nog i viss mån att det är bra också. Men vi ser ju också tendenser att arbetsgivare börjar dra tillbaks lite grann. Så här, vi vill nog gärna ha våra medarbetare lite mer på kontoret av precis de här anledningarna. Så att jag tror inte vi har sett slutet på den här riktigt än.
Då kommer vi avsluta panelsamtalet med den lite öppna frågan. Men vi säger tusen tack till Jens Nordqvist, Magnus Hedberg och Einar Humlin. Tack så mycket!
Tack.
And then we have about 10 minutes left, and I was wondering if Samuel, Diana, and Lotta Stein would like to come up again. It's not that kind to you. Try to listen to Swedish.
I have a lot of comments on that.
My basically request, having you two here, is to sum up and conclude both what the researchers said earlier and what the panel said, but that's for you, Lotta. If you have any reflections, and let me start with Samuel. What do you take with you?
Yeah. So I'm not going to summarize what we just said, but I think there are 3 themes that I thought were very important for both my colleagues and also Loda. is, and also I think I picked up some concepts. I mean, so I think the first thing I'd like to say is about collective bargaining. I think and I very much agree. I mean, and even in places where it is not the land of collective bargaining, it should become, not because I think, and there are bad examples of collective bargaining, like in the US or maybe the French model, but in good places, in places where there are findings where it is extremely positive for workers and employers, I think it should be, it should basically become a priority for global work. And I think it's an opportunity for unions and workers to reinvent themselves in this new world. And I don't know where this is going to be possible, whether there is going to be the human resources and the money to do so. But the good news is that the law is okay with that, right? I mean, my colleague said earlier, and it's true, like there is an EU directive that was, I don't know if it's been implemented yet or no, it's been passed by the parliament, but prior to that directive, the main issue with global collective bargaining and European collective bargaining for independent contractors, and especially those who are incorporated, is that it's a cartel and it's in violation of competition law. So now there's an exemption to that. But that doesn't mean it is going to be feasible, because that requires a lot of work, and I'm not an expert in collective labor law, so I think this is a question that needs to be discussed. Second point is, and I think it relates to this first point, is and it goes back to what Loda was showing us about digital nomads. And I think, in my opinion, not only remote work is here to stay, but global work is here to stay and here to grow, based on what I've seen in the last 4 years. And I'm talking also about post-COVID. I don't think, and I think that's one of the main questions I'm trying to answer with this a group of economists, is I think we're trying to redefine the notion of digital nomad. I think that the idea is that, they're just a bunch of, early 20s. It's not true anymore. I mean, I am a digital nomad in many ways. My wife is, and she's in finance. I mean, these organizations, can you believe pre-COVID, a bank allowing people to work off? No, so I don't think, and we're talking about a remote worker that working for a bank that's not based in Canada. Okay. So I think the world is really changing, and I think obviously I need to answer that question. So I think we need to redefine the concept of digital nomad. I think that's why global remote worker or cross-border work is more appropriate, because I think it concerns more and more workers that are not necessarily the typical examples of the 20-year-old kid that's just going to go to Bali and work from there, right? So now the third point, the third theme I'd love to discuss is this notion of profits. I think what I've seen so far, based again on the deal data, so I don't know if we can extrapolate to other companies, is the priorities, right? Definitely workers care about pension, and health, obviously, and a lot of companies like Deal and other EOR have been doing some decent work, and also governments, at helping independent contractors to achieve that goal, right? But what's interesting is that profits you're right. It's such, and I don't know if it's a generational thing, but I feel like, I don't know if there is someone from Deal here, but I think I would say about a good chunk, more than a majority of workers are getting equity from the client company. So which is not something that would have been, imaginable. So that creates a lot of legal hurdles. So for example, if you're an employer of record, you cannot really get the same tax benefit as a regular as a domestic employee. So that's something that needs to be resolved first. However, there's another problem that I'm seeing also, is that a lot of client companies are using the profit sharing variable as a way to cut wages. So but the problem is that in if you're investing or getting paid in stock options, sometimes a lot of workers don't know the difference between a stock option and a stock, so that's also can be tricky. And also, it's a bit of a gamble, right? A lot of companies are going to be 90% of the startups. Okay, Deal is a good example. Now the capitalization of Deal is $12 billion, right? Great, but a lot of companies don't end up there. So that may be pretty damaging for workers if you end up, half of your salary is in stock options, and after 2 years the stocks are worth nothing. So there are a lot of, so these are the three themes. I think you're very much like, your point is it made me think about this data set that I've seen from another company called Carta. They're like the equity management platform. And the number of employees are getting equity paid, but also I think it would be interesting to see if there's a negative correlation with the wage level. And that may not be great, right? Further. So these were not concluding the whole summary. This was not a summary, but just like some additional reflection for the future.
Very nice. Yeah, a lot of you
More
also had
research is needed.
Yeah, definitely.
That's how we finish every seminar.
Yeah.
No, I mean we're touching on so many kind of interesting topics here. I mean we've talked about globalization and what drives globalization. Obviously, technology is a prime driver here, I think. We're talking about distance work. I mean, we have not seen the end of that discussion either, and what it will entail in terms of productivity and management skills, etc. However, I think that when we talk about all these things, I think it's obvious that new ways of organizing work might challenge the notion of going to work and what that means. And it's not all going to be good. I mean, it is clear to me that distance workers, I mean, the digital nomads, whatever you want to call them, they're going to be less solidaric with their company because they don't have strong ties to their companies. I mean, for most of us, part of being part of an organization is that there are other people there you like. And, you know, if you don't meet
like.
them, or, well, they can also be not so but I mean, overall, I think these are very important trade-offs, and especially when you're a country like Sweden, where you're actually one of the greatest things we have in Sweden is trust and these kinds of social relations where we kind of solve, you know, like they were saying, these guys who like the Swedish model. I mean, one of the side effects of the Swedish model is actually like creating a culture of like reasonableness, I would say, I would call it. And so, you know, that might be a challenge when there's less strong ties between people. What else do I want to say? Well, I think another challenge that perhaps I wasn't clear on in my presentation is that the issue of a collective becomes an issue when the organization is spread out. We have collective bargaining, but well, if there's no collective, who are, you know, like, who's bargaining for whom and on what premises? So that I think is interesting. But overall, I just want to say that I think that hearing these different perspectives and talking about these issues from sort of multiple angles is really fascinating, and I think that it makes it very clear that we don't have all the answers. We don't know where this is going, but I do think that it is really important to have this conversation. I mean, even if we can't just say like, oh, here's the answer. This is what we need. I think that it is good to talk about it.
Great. Time's up. And I want to thank all of you, especially those of you who have been on stage, and especially Samuel, who's our global nomad today. and to the audience, of course. Yeah. Thank you so much.